Welcome. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar, hosted by the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations. My name is Victor Trinidad with NCPMI. This webinar is part of the Digging into Data webinar series. Today's topic is Analyzing Program-Wide Pyramid Model Implementation, Introduction to the Benchmarks of Quality, presented by Lisa Fox and Denise Perez-Binder.
Great. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you here. I'm Lisa Fox with the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations, and happy to present with my colleague, Denise Perez-Binder, who is also a co-author of the Benchmarks of Quality tool.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining.
So we do have a small group, which is going to be great because then you can ask your questions and we can even have a little bit of a discussion. So let's look at what we're going to talk about today. So our agenda, we just want to hit really briefly kind of why data. We want to all be on the same page in the same context. Then we're going to walk through the tool, and then we'll talk about how the tool is used by program leadership teams for making program decisions. So we think about data. Data is not about adding more things to your plate. Data is about making sure you have the right things on your plate. So in the pyramid implementation, we don't look at it as a burdensome task, but it's really a task that helps us work more efficiently, to be more strategic, to cut through some of the noise and really be able to make good, high quality decisions as we do this work. And so data is more than a requirement. And it's not meant in any way to be a gotcha. It's not to send to someone else so someone can tell you what you're not doing right? So data are for figuring out, are we doing what we wanted to do? Are we accomplishing it? And are we meeting our outcomes? And how do we get there? And so we view data as really productive and important. So in order to do data decision making, there's some assumptions that we're making and that we would assume that you're making as a leadership team. First of all, that you have a vision, you know what you're intending to do. That in establishing that vision of what you want to achieve, you've identified and articulated and operationalized what outcomes you're seeking to achieve. And then you measure your progress to get there. So we don't want to just have this kind of lofty vision of what we're trying to get, but that we've articulated the outcomes and we know our progress towards reaching it. And in the pyramid model, especially since our outcomes are ambitious in terms of the social, emotional, and behavioral health of all children and the support of our staff in order to meet them, those are big outcomes. So in order to achieve that, we want to make sure we're doing the work that will help us get there with fidelity. And so we're going to measure both our outcomes, but also our fidelity in the inputs to get to those outcomes. The next assumption is that when you collect data, then they're summarized and they're used for decision making. So data that are gathered and put in a file cabinet are useless. There's no point in that. Or data that are gathered and put in an Excel that someone else owns and they look at it and you don't look at it, that doesn't have a good purpose and it's not a good use of your time. But data that will generate for you a visual that then you can look at, think about collectively with your team and make decisions is really important and highly valued. And then the last assumption is that this is an ongoing endeavor, right? That we're continuously gathering some kind of data in our work. If you go to the next slide, we love this next slide that really illustrates. If you've ever been on a team and trying to do problem solving, you know that you can just go all over the place, right? And sometimes we end up in rabbit holes we can't even get out of. And it doesn't get us directly to a solution. When you have the data, then everyone collectively looks at the same thing, can ask questions together. They have a shared focus. And that really helps us get to problem solving more efficiently. We've tried to, in all the tools that we've developed with the pyramid model, they all give you a visual output. So you have a shared focus. You have a shared visual context that everyone can follow along, know what we're talking about, ask questions of the data, and come to decisions about what they want to do. So today, what we're going to talk about, of course, in our data is around the pyramid model. And so our why, our vision, our outcomes, right? So that was one of the assumptions, right? So what are our outcomes? We want our kids to do better in social emotional skills. We want teachers to have the ability to work with all children, each and every child, including children with challenging behavior, and importantly, children with disabilities. We want to make sure that kids have the social, emotional, and behavioral skills that help them be engaged in kindergarten programs when they arrive there and continue with a good learning trajectory in their school programs. And we want to make sure that we're building responsive relationships with children and families. And these are important outcomes of the pyramid model. But to get there, we have to implement the pyramid model with fidelity, right? So that's really our goal. Our goal as a leadership team, hopefully you're working with a leadership team, is to make sure that this idea of the pyramid model is being implemented with fidelity. Both Denise and I will share with you that implementing the pyramid model with fidelity is not just the job of teachers, right? It's not that we sent teachers off to a training and they learn how to do practices and they come back and they better do those practices with fidelity. It's the job of the program to support the teachers to be able to learn about practices and to use those practices. And so we're in this webinar, we're going to be talking about program-wide implementation, and we're going to talk about the program-wide tool that will help us implement the pyramid model. So you can go to the next slide, and you can go to the next slide. So that's where the previous slide, sorry.
That's okay.
All right, so that's the benchmarks of quality. It's a program level fidelity tool. It's a tool used at the program by the leadership team. And it helps them examine what we call the implementation infrastructure, which is all of the functions, and Denise will unpack that for you, all the functions that help teachers use those practices that help children so that children and family achieve the outcomes that we have a goal. And so this tool will help them know, the leadership team, what progress have they made in their implementation, what their strengths are in their implementation, and kind of what's next for the big work that they're doing. And then you could go to the next slide for me. Thanks. So this tool, like all of our other structures, this one's used at the implementation site by the program leadership team. So in pyramid model implementation, at the state leadership team, at program implementation coaches, at the program level, we all use data in an ongoing way to make decisions about, are we doing what we intended to do? And that is what is implementation fidelity. So Denise, why don't you take us to the benchmarks?
Sure. So the benchmarks of quality, right? So it's a tool that's going to be completed by your leadership team at a particular implementation site. And we really think that concept of team is the most important here. So we don't want it to be one person looking at all the critical elements and thinking about them, but really a leadership team, a team of people that represents different facets, different backgrounds, and different experiences within that specific program. So we'll come together as a team and we're going to assess ourselves on these 7 critical elements that we think are crucial to your implementation fidelity of pyramid model practices. And we want your leadership team to come together to do an initial assessment. And we know it's going to be scary. And you're going to think that, oh my God, we're not doing anything right. But that's not the case. This tool will help you see where your strengths are. And most importantly, I think, where very specifically we need to focus our attention and our work so that we can get closer and closer and closer to our implementation fidelity. We hope that teams will update their benchmarks at least annually. Teams that I've been working with for a while, they like to do it twice a year, but whatever your team can manage, but at least try to get to it at least once a year, all 7 critical elements. And then when we look at the critical elements, we're rating each benchmark with a 0 that it's not in place yet, or something that we need to focus our work on, or to a 2. That means that benchmark is completely in place. We've worked on it and we've got it maintained. So that's kind of the process for your benchmarks. I talked a little bit about critical elements. And so this visual, which I'm a very visual learner, so this makes so much sense to my brain. But these 7 elements we think are crucial to your solid, your durable changes that you need to make in order to be at fidelity with program-wide implementation. We start with thinking about the leadership team. And I've already talked about how important we think it is, but we have benchmarks around leadership team or components that we feel like you need to have in order to get that durable, strong change that we're looking for. We move to staff buy-in to ensure that your whole staff understands the change process and are on board with you. We think about family engagement, how we include families in the changes and the decisions that we're making across our program. We look at program-wide expectations. We look at how, as a collective, we respond to children who are having issues of challenging behavior. We think about how we will provide continuous professional development in the form of classroom coaching to all our teachers. That means our teachers that have been with us for years and years. That means our teachers that are brand new to our program and coming in maybe mid-year. How do we make sure all those teachers with all that different level of background experience can have access to professional development and ongoing coaching? And our last critical element, and even though it's last, we think it's super, super important, is making sure that your team is poised to look at data on a regular basis, to examine, to think about it, and then to make decisions, to make changes based on what your specific data is telling you on a regular basis. So this is the benchmarks form, what your team will come together and look at and assess at least on an annual basis. You can see that it starts off on the left-hand column with the critical elements. So those are the 7 things that we just looked at that went around the pyramid. And then in the middle column is the benchmarks. So each critical element is assigned a range of benchmarks. These are the things that the little steps that get you closer to being at full implementation around that critical element. And then last column is your score. So as a leadership team, we read each benchmark together, and then we assign a score based on where we think we are at currently with that particular benchmark. And so we'll go all the way through critical elements looking at that. So this is the staff buy-in. You'll notice different from the leadership team critical element, the staff buy-in critical element only has 2 benchmarks. So 2 things that we need to plan around, to work around, to make sure our staff know what's happening on our program and they have input as we go through the change process. Family engagement critical element has a couple more benchmarks that we want to look at and we want to keep going back to on a regular basis to make sure that we have multiple ways that our families can share information, can meet with teachers on a regular basis, can have information delivered to them, and they can share their opinions as well. For program-wide expectations, the benchmarks gives your team guidelines for how to develop expectations that will be relevant across your whole program. So every person that steps on your program will know your expectations, that staff and families had input in what they think is important, the skills that they really think are important for the development of their child and their children in their classroom, and that those expectations are shared with families and all staff, and translated in ways that make sense for home and community. For professional development, these benchmarks help us get a handle on how coaching will happen in our program, how what the caseload can be, how we select a classroom coach, what kinds of training and support needs to happen for that person who's pinged as your classroom coach. And then there's always thinking about process for training new staff, making sure everybody in our program knows our vision, knows our mission around pyramid model implementation, and they can get on board and they can get the support and the resources they need to be able to deliver that in their classroom and with the families that they support. Our critical element around responding to challenging behavior really has your leadership team taking a look at how all teachers across your program are providing consistency and predictability in the way that they teach and the way that they respond to challenging behavior. We want to make sure that whichever classroom or whatever part of the program the child is accessing, the rules are always the same. And the responses and how redirections are delivered is always the same. When we can do that for kids, we see this need for engaging in problem behaviors decrease so effectively and so efficiently when we are all on the same page. So this critical element really helps us get there, really helps us provide structure in a way that's team-based, that's sensitive to family values, and really focused on the whole child when we're delivering behavior interventions. And then lastly is our critical element around monitoring in our data. So it helps your leadership team really figure out what kinds of data you should be looking at, the frequency which you are looking at data, and then how you're sharing that data and the outcomes with your whole staff, with families across your program. So we think once a year that your leadership team, at a minimum, your leadership team will come together as a collective and assess all 41 of those benchmarks and really think about where you're at and give yourself a score of not in place 0, partially in place 1, or in place 2. And once you go through that and give yourself a score, we have a fabulous Excel workbook where you can note your scores on each benchmark. You can note the date, and then the output is so, again, the visual is so powerful for gaining that buy-in. It's really powerful for sharing information with lots of different groups. And it is going to be the tool that helps us build implementation plans or action plans that help us get closer and closer to that full fidelity that we're striving for. So on this graph, on this visual, the first graph is just a bar graph with each critical element at the bottom, and it gives us the level of implementation of each critical element. And you can see this graph is showing 2 points in time. So every year we can come together and we can see where we were, where we've moved to, and what we still need to work on. So it will show growth over time, which is a really powerful way to stay motivated to keep doing this hard work. And then there's lots of different ways that you can look at the data, and we'll dig into that in a little bit deeper in a minute. So once your team has assessed your benchmarks, all 41, you've put it in your Excel graph, then we use that graph, we use that data to think about what's our next steps, action steps that we need to do as a team to get closer to our full implementation. And we use this form, which is available on challengingbehavior.org website, the NCPMI website, and it's called the Leadership Team Implementation Plan. So on this plan, we can feature specific critical elements by looking at our benchmarks graph and where are we still kind of low. We pull out that critical element and then we start thinking about the different benchmarks that may be at a 0 or maybe at a 1. And then we action plan very specific steps around how to get that closer to full implementation, that benchmark to full implementation. We list the person that's responsible, like we do on all of our good action plans. And then when we're going to think that that action step should be completed. So thinking about looking at the data and being able to make really good decisions off the benchmarks once you've completed it with your team, we really think this whole idea of teaming is so critical to the power and the durability of your plan. We really think, it sounds cliche, but it takes a team. We need that leadership team to go through this good teaming process to everybody at the table feels that they have a voice and that their voice is heard. And we have ways of talking and communicating our differences and working those things out. And using our different background experiences and our different knowledge and our different skills to really build a plan that's going to affect all the learners and all of the families in our program. So when we come together for our monthly leadership team meetings, you'll have a person that we call data coordinator. This person will be in charge of reviewing the benchmarks of quality data ahead of time, and then preparing that data in a way that our team can effectively and efficiently, because we know we don't always have tons of time at our monthly meetings to sit and look at data. So we want the data coordinator to kind of prepare some questions for the team to think about when we come together as a big group. That way, during our meeting, we can really focus on action plan items that we want to work on or things that that we want to have happen in the future. So your data coordinator gets the BOQ graph, and then they'll look at it for any patterns, any trends, any areas of critical questions. They make sure that they have enough copies of that graph or table or whatever it is, and they bring those to the leadership team meeting. And then as a team, we can look at those graphs and answer some good questions. So we think that in looking at data, and we know everybody is in different places. When you bring your leadership team together, everybody will be at different places or have a different comfort level when it comes to looking at data and making sense of an Excel pie chart or a histogram, and what does that really mean? So coming together in a very structured way when we look at the data will be important to the efficiency of your planning. So we kind of have this decision-making cycle that we would like all teams to go through with benchmarks and with other pyramid model tools. And we start by looking at the data. So our data coordinator has gathered our Excel spreadsheets or our tables, and we're looking at it for patterns, for trends, for things that we want to highlight. And then when we come together with our team, we're going to look at those graphs, we're going to analyze them, we're going to think about what's sticking out and what levels are going up to a 2 and they're totally in place, but what are still stuck at a 1. And so we think about those 1s and the 0s, and we're really trying to analyze the different benchmarks and what we need to do. And so when we think about it in those very structured ways, then we can develop an action plan that's really specific to the needs of your program or staff or families to make sure that we're getting the most bang for our buck. So we want your leadership team once a month to pull this data and to kind of go through this look, think, act cycle. And so because we know that all teams are at different levels with looking and analyzing data, we have what we call the look, think, act worksheets. And we have these worksheets available on NCPMI for all of our tools, but specifically for benchmarks of quality. This is what the worksheet looks like. So it gives you some ideas of how to look at the data, what graphs to pull, how to get it organized. And then it gives you some ideas of think questions. So what do you need to think about? Are you seeing this versus this? And if you are seeing this, here's some potential action steps that you can take. So we really hope that your leadership team, when you come together to look at your benchmarks of quality, your data coordinator will pull the look, think, act worksheet for benchmarks and have those ideas ready so we can think about very specific questions to ask of our benchmarks. Some things that we want to think about when we're looking at our benchmarks data, thinking about, are we staying the same on a certain benchmark? It's not moving, it's staying at a 1. How can we get it to a 2? We want to think about have there been any major changes in our program during the year that might be affecting that trend or that pattern with that particular critical element. So maybe there was a new initiative, a new literacy initiative that we adopted last year, and it kind of moved our attention away from our pyramid model resources. So we want to take those things into consideration when we're looking at our data and we're thinking about what's going on. So let's take a look at a particular program's benchmarks data. We're going to look at it, then we'll have some examples of what they thought about as a team, and then some potential action steps. So this preschool is Under the Sun. They're located in Sunnyburg, Florida. They have 45 kids ages 2 to 5 in 4 classrooms. Each classroom has a lead teacher and usually an assistant teacher, but their administrator admits that they've been struggling to keep staff. She's got a lot of turnover and she's really having a hard time. Her staff is coming to her all the time complaining about behavior, complaining about lack of family support, and they're just overall frustrated with the amount of time they have to spend redirecting and correcting kids' challenging behavior. So with that, the administrator decided to take a small team through program-wide training And they all feel really excited about this change, and they're ready to make some changes across their center. So remember, I showed you the implementation planning form. This is the front page of that, and this is what their page looked like. So you can see that they have an administrator on their team, they have a program coach, they have a teacher from their 3-year-old classroom, and a teacher from their 4-year-old classroom on their team. And they've all kind of assigned roles for how they're going to work on the team, on their leadership team. The thing I liked about it was that the administrator did not take on the role as the facilitator. So she let somebody, one of the teachers, be the team lead. And I think that's really valuable thing to think about when you're building that leadership team. So you get those different perspectives and we get different ideas when we're getting ready to assess our benchmarks. So after they left program-wide training, this was the baseline benchmarks of quality that they assessed. So you can see they feel like they're at ones in a lot of their critical elements, maybe a little bit higher on program-wide expectations when they left. But this is the graph that they'll bring to their first meeting, and they'll really start to look at what's happening, things that are going well, things that are not happening at all, like monitoring implementation and outcomes is a 0 right now, and that's okay. But it's just something to look at and to think about as we move forward. So also on our Excel, we can look a little bit deeper than the bar graph, and we can look at the number of benchmarks that are not in place or partially in place. And we really want to start examining those particular benchmarks, especially in our first couple of critical elements like leadership team, like staff buy-in, like family engagement. If we have lots of benchmarks that are not in place, that's where, as a program coach, I like to help my team start focusing, to really start thinking about what is not in place and what are some little things we can do to get those to a 1 or a 2 if we can in a short period of time. So here is the paper copy of their benchmarks. And so we can particularly analyze and think about what benchmarks for leadership team critical element were at a 0 or at a 1. What staff buy-in benchmarks were at a 0 or a 1. We can look at them really specifically. And as a team, you want to come together and look at specifically like leadership team benchmarks number 6 and 7. Those are scored at a 0. So what can we do in a really short period of time, really quick and really efficiently, to get those bumped up to a 1 or a 2 if we can? So this is the action plan that they came up with, and I just copied their leadership implementation plan. So that was the form that we've been working on. And they looked at those 2 elements that were at a 0. They decided that they wanted to finalize their mission statement, which is benchmarks number 6. They wanted to finalize that mission statement. They started it during training, but you never have enough time during training. And they wanted to get staff input. So then they write these little action steps that get them closer to full implementation of that benchmarks. So they're going to get out the draft that they did at training, get a copy of that draft to all staff, and then give staff some time to have some input and some suggestions. And then as a team come together for a final statement and then share that with their staff. So we hope that your leadership team would be able to go through that look, think, act process at your monthly meetings. We don't think you have to tackle every single benchmark that's at a 0 at one time, because that's just crazy talk. But pick one that is at a 0 that if you get that done, we can make a big impact on the way our team functions or the way our staff is bought into the process. And then we just go on to the next.
Great. Thanks, Denise. I'm going to pause and see if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question. I had put in the chat, I was asking a question of them of who's doing program-wide, if they're using on a leadership team. Anybody have a question? You can put in the Q&A pod, or you could unmute and ask it, because there are not many of us here. You could raise your hand and someone will unmute you, right? No one's raising their hands, right? Anyone? So one thing we didn't say, which is so important, and you made me think of it, Denise, in your framing of the actions of really picking things that are strategic that you can get done, that's going to make a difference, is, implementation program-wide is we call it a marathon, right? It takes time, and you've got to pace yourself. And it takes multiple years to get to full implementation fidelity, and programs need to give themselves that time. You can see obviously a lot of growth and a lot of outcome really quickly, but we want you to take bite-sized pieces that are achievable as you do that work. So let's look at this other scenario. So this is a program that's further down the road. And what you see on this graph is that they have a measure that they did in 2019 and then one in 2020. And so you can see from their bar graph on the top, from their histogram, their growth in each of the elements. So they're really getting up there in their leadership team, and they had a little bit of growth. If we look at our data, the staff buy-in is flat, so it didn't move over a year. If you look at the next element, the family engagement, the reason there's no blue line is that it's at a 0. So they really worked on family engagement and made some progress. Program-wide expectations, what we see there is some really nice growth. Professional development, they had nice growth. Procedures for responding to challenging behavior, they had some growth. That's a really important critical element that deserves a lot of investment of time, and we'll talk about that and what this group decided to do. And then you see that their monitoring of implementation and outcomes, so using data to look at implementation as well as outcomes, had a lot of growth. And then if you look down at percent of indicators, I love this graphic display because it shows you, the green grows and the red gets smaller. And so you can see that, boy, they really have almost all of their benchmarks either partially in place, so that means they've worked on them or are doing something around them, and a lot green. Those are the ones who are fully in place. So this team has a lot to be proud of. They've done a lot of work. They're really moving into a really nice place of fidelity. But as they reflected on the data, they pointed out, well, our staff buy-in didn't move. What are we missing here? What should we be doing? And nurturing staff buy-in continuously and making sure you're really investing in that is super important to your sustainability. We don't want the pyramid model to be a one-shot wonder, right? We want it to sustain in our programs. So they looked at it, they expressed concern that it hadn't moved, and they wanted to work on some ideas around that. The other one that popped for them that was a concern was the challenging behavior one. And so they wanted to move on that, and they wanted to come up with some ideas. So just a sample from their implementation plan, after they looked at the staff buy-in not moving, they came up with this. They wanted to make sure that staff were more deeply invested, and they not only saw their data that shows staff buy-in was flat, but they had comments in their suggestion box that indicated staff were a little grousy about some of the work involved in the pyramid model. And so they have some action steps laid out with doing a staff survey, which is a great way to really unpack how people are feeling specific to the pyramid model work and different features of it. And they've then figured out who's going to do the survey, how will it get done, and let's get it implemented. So a really great step for this program to deepen their work around implementation. Oh, it looks like now we're getting some chatting and some questions. So the Excel is actually on the website. So we'll get to questions, but yeah, go ahead. So one of the cool things about all of our tools, except for the ones that are published, like the Teapot and Tippy Toes, but all the ones that we've developed without a publisher and that we publish as NCPMI are available for free on the website along with Excel. Great, I'm glad you found it. And we're going to point out where. So one of the things I want you to know about, especially if you're new to all of this, is our pyramid model data roadmap. It's a great document. It's going to be right there on the page. I'll show you in a minute what our website looks like and where you find it. And it's going to have all the information on all the data tools. So I didn't want to neglect to not mention that and not point it out to you. So let's look at what's in the data roadmap. I think we have another slide on it. Yeah, so every tool we have is described and kind of the why of that tool. We have a sample of what the output looks like so that you can get a feel for what these Excels will generate for you and how you might use them. And then it makes sure you know about your Look, Think, Act guide and gives you the link for that. So it's really useful to go and pull down this data roadmap and kind of have it at your fingertips for doing some of this work. Go to the next slide. The other thing that's way cool, and you're going to find this on our data page. I'll show you where the data page is in a minute. In the general resources, is one item on the benchmarks of quality is sharing data out. So as we collect data and we use data as a leadership team, there's also the value of sharing data with our teachers and sharing data with our families. Now, of course, you're not going to just throw out your Excel to your teachers and families, right? You're going to want to share data in a way that captures their attention, that deepens their investment in the work, that lets them see what you're doing. So we pulled like the little cute infographic that comes from the benchmarks of quality, and so what we've designed is infographics. All you have to do is plug in your numbers and you'll get these cute pictures, or say which elements you want to profile on this particular. This is one of my favorite, this little clipboard infographic. And then you'll have the picture and you can take that picture, you could put on a bulletin board, you could put it in a newsletter, you could just, wherever you want to do it, show it in a staff meeting. And so they're about the benchmarks of quality, but there are also some critical elements about other data pieces that we use in the pyramid model. So I wanted you to know about those infographics and know that you have resources in which you can meet that benchmark that's important about sharing our data with teachers and families. So go to the next page. I'll show you where everything is. So back up one. All right. So go to challengingbehavior.org, pull down under implementation and go to data decision making. And when you click in there, I think actually it breaks out, you'll go to overview and then you'll see everything. So we call these colored lines the accordions. When you click them, they open up and you'll find everything in there. So under classroom and program tools, you see is the benchmarks of quality, which is what we're talking about. And the whole collection of what goes with that, the tool, the Excel, the Look, Think, Act is there. On the front page of every Excel is a recording on how to use the Excel. So if you're new to Excel, or you're kind of like, how do I navigate this? Click on the recording so that you can hear about how to do it. And they're really clear instructions. And then that infographic, so down on the bottom of this page, see other data resources. It's in general resources. And actually all the videos and all our digging into data webinars are down in that dark blue accordion on the bottom of the page. So everything's right there for you. So we will be doing more webinar series this year. We're going to really work on all of our data tools. Last year, we spent the whole year teaching people about the behavior incident report system. But this year, we're going to dedicate each webinar to a different data tool. Thank you for coming to this one. We're going to do one next on the coaching log, the practitioner and classroom coaching log. We will do Teapot and Tippy Toes, which are our classroom tools for practices. Teapot is preschool, Tippy Toes is infant toddler. Then we'll do one on our early intervention practices, which that tool is called the IPFI, if you're wondering how to say that. And then the last tool that we're going to do is the community-wide benchmarks of quality, where you don't have a leadership team at the program level, but you're having a team at a community level that looks to establish all of your program implementation sites. So I wanted you to know that those are coming up. And then I wanted you to know, if you're a data geek, and you probably are because you hung on to this webinar for the whole time and showed up to hear us talk about data. But these are 3 resources from our colleagues at the DAISY Technical Assistance Center and ECTA that we found particularly useful. So if you want to know more about data governance, the use of data around issues of equity, building a culture of data with a lens on equity, we wanted to make sure that you could access these references. We have posted the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint will continue to be posted with this recording. So you can access it, and you can click in and find these particular resources if you want to do that. I'm hoping we have questions because we have a little bit of time, just a little bit of time to answer some of them, but you also can raise your hand and unmute, and we would love for you to do that as well.
So Lisa, we do have one question from Carrie in the Q&A. So she asked, is it wise to gather staff buy-in before you establish a leadership team and take them through the full leadership team training? So we think it's really important to do some sort of pitch to your staff. We want to, I call it a pitch, but just some sort of introduction to your staff about this is a program that we want to get into, and we are taking a team through this. We're going to be really methodical, and it maybe goes through the different parts of implementation for pyramid model. What does that mean for them in their classrooms? And we actually have a kind of a sample PowerPoint that you may use on the NCPMI website to do that introduction. You know, you can feel free to change it up and make it your own, but we do think that that would be really important to, before you invest all this time and energy into really action planning with a team, that staff buy-in is one of your goals. We also ask on the benchmarks that you take a poll of all staff and that you receive at least 80% agreement from all staff that they feel like, yeah, this is a really good thing for us to do. And we want to commit to doing the 2 to 3 year process with you. And so I want to walk into that kind of lightly. If you go to do your poll and you don't receive 80% in the beginning, it doesn't mean that we just trash everything that we want to do. It means that that's where we start working, right? So it means that that's the first action plan step we need to work on. Does that mean that we need to maybe have small group meetings with different teachers, or maybe one-on-one meetings where we share different kinds of information or more information, maybe more videos or testimonials? Something of that will help them understand why we think this change is important for our kids and for our families. So if you don't get 80% on your poll, it's not the end all of everything. It just means that where we start.
So I do want to add to that. So we have had teams kind of do a 2-parter, like they'll show, we have a pyramid model overview video on the website that you can download and use. And you might have a meeting and say, what do y'all think? Right? We've been experiencing a lot of problem behavior, or social emotional is one of our priorities. Look at the video, talk about, do we want to get into it, and not do the vote yet. And then you might come to leadership team training, kind of get into it more deeply. You'll be more confident fielding questions, and then do your poll afterwards. So we've also had people kind of go at it that way, right, Denise?
Yep, for sure.
We have a question about social curriculum, and Michelle asked, what social curriculum would you recommend? We've been using PATHS for several years and would like to change. PATHS is a really good one and evidence-based. In terms of a standalone social emotional curricula, another one you might think about is Incredible Years, although it comes with a kind of hefty price tag. Connect for Learning is one that our colleague Mary Louise Hemmeter was a part of. It has both science, math, literacy, and social emotional in it. I don't know if you're just looking for the social emotional piece. Second Step is a tried and true. And if you're wondering about like a document that analyzes all of them, I think on the eClick website, they have one that analyzes social emotional curricula. And if you can't find it, Michelle, you're welcome to email me. My email is on the NCPMI website. You're welcome to email me and I can find it for you, because I know I've saved it somewhere. But I like the idea that people supplement their pyramid work with a curriculum, because I think it can be really helpful for teachers to have some kind of structure to some of their social emotional teaching. But we have had programs where teachers kind of know the pyramid practices in and out and aren't using any kind of supplement or curriculum to do that work. Any other questions? I have one for you, Denise, about the scoring of the benchmarks of quality. Do you want to talk a little bit about, does one person or the leader do the scoring? Do they all do it individually and then come together? How is it designed to be scored?
So, good question. We really want you to think about that whole team. And when your team is representative of different facets, then we get a really good picture of what's happening right now and where we need to go. So we want your team to come to consensus on your score. And that can be a lofty task, but we really want everybody on the team to feel like their voice is heard and their opinions are heard and taken into consideration. So you might think about having someone read the benchmarks, and then we go around the table and kind of say what our individual ideas are, or what our individual score is. And then we brainstorm and we talk to each other until we come up with what our final score would be. But yeah, we want everybody to talk about it that's on the leadership team, and we want to come to a consensus score.
Thank you to our panelists for your wonderful insights. Your feedback is very important to the work that we do. Please remember to provide your feedback on this webinar with our post-webinar survey by typing the web address shown on this slide into your internet browser. Your certificate of attendance will appear once you submit the survey. We invite you to visit our website, challengingbehavior.org, to sign up for our upcoming webinars, access recordings, download pyramid model resources, and more. Thank you to our funder for making this webinar possible. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.